We begin with breaking news. The Manhattan DA's office told the court that it is against overturning President-elect Donald Trump's conviction in his so-called hush money case out of New York. In a new filing, the DA says Trump's upcoming return to the White House isn't a reason to drop the case, but he would consider possibly freezing the case until after his presidential term ends. You'll recall a jury found that the former president illegally falsified business records to cover up payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election, making him the first former president in U.S. history to be convicted of a crime. We have team coverage for you now. CBS News investigative reporter Graham Kates has been covering Trump's legal cases for us, and CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson is here to provide analysis. Thank you both so much for being here. Graham, help us understand the crux of the filing and other notable details.
Sure. So I think you hit on it. There's kind of three main points. The first is that they do plan on opposing a motion to dismiss. And that motion, as was kind of briefly described in a letter from Trump's lawyers, will argue that there will be an unconstitutional burden for President-elect Trump, or depending on when this plays out, President Trump, having this hang over his head as he's going about his duties. And the DA said that there's no precedent for throwing out a case because someone was elected to office when they were already convicted when they were just a civilian. And then they suggested two different modes of delaying the proceedings. Now, remember, as of this moment, technically the sentencing is on the books for November 26th, although it seems very, very unlikely that that's going to happen. And they said, we don't oppose delaying that while the motion to dismiss plays out. But separately, because of the issue of constitutionality and the kind of new questions raised by Trump being president while these things are happening, they said we wouldn't necessarily oppose pushing this off until he's done being president all the way in 2029. And for a little bit of context, we're talking about a case that stems from an investigation that began all the way back in 2018.
And so, Graham, you had mentioned that the sentencing is supposed to be November 26th. You said it's very unlikely that would happen. But in this filing, we know that the DA does give a couple of other deadlines on like response times, et cetera. What happens next in this case?
Sure. So the first thing is that Trump's team has to respond just to this letter. And then the judge makes a decision. But then if there is a motion to dismiss, Trump's team is going to file that. The DA has to respond to that. And then there's yet another decision that we're waiting on for this judge. And those things that we're waiting on from the judge now are beginning to pile up.
Jessica, is there any precedent for a possible delay of this magnitude?
Well, not in this situation. I mean, certainly we have had delays in cases before. But we have never been here before. Let's be clear. When we think about precedent, this is unprecedented. We've never had a former president of the United States who's convicted of felonies. We've never had that person then be elected to be once again the president again. And we've never had to deal with these constitutional questions that Graham talked about, which is we're talking about a state prosecution and a conviction. And we're talking about whether or not the state criminal justice system is potentially unconstitutionally interfering with the future president's duties and abilities under the Constitution to do things like to take care to faithfully execute the law. Now, we all talked about decisions like the immunity decision from the Supreme Court, all of which is to say the law acknowledges that presidents are different from the rest of us and that presidents in a lot of ways have a protective bubble around them. And I think we're about to find out when it comes to this situation, a state criminal conviction, how big that protective bubble is. But Lindsay, it's a great question. Have we ever been here before in terms of a delay? Sure, we've had delays for unusual circumstances. I'm not at this moment thinking about a delay of 4 years, particularly when that's tracking a presidential administration.
Jessica, when you were talking about the immunity ruling, I mean, would the DA essentially argue that that wouldn't apply here because these actions were taken when he was a candidate?
So Graham alluded to the idea that there are a number of different motions that we're waiting for this judge to rule on. And one of the questions actually is the effect of that Supreme Court decision which addressed whether or not presidents or former presidents enjoy immunity from criminal prosecution, the effect of that decision on this case. Now, I think you've very cleanly pointed out the question here, right? Which is, for the acts that President Trump was convicted of committing, are those official acts or are those private acts? And certainly the prosecution has argued those were private acts. And because even if you are writing the checks as president, it's a continuation of what you did as a candidate. It's not directing Congress to say, spend money and pay Stormy Daniels. It's, here's money from a private account or from my private attorney. That decision on immunity was actually supposed to be made, I believe, last week. That's also put on pause. Exactly as Graham said, we're waiting for a number of things from this judge now.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to put on your hypothetical defense attorney hat, but as a professor, if you were to put this to your students, if you were Donald Trump's defense attorney, what would you say? Would you imagine that in their response, they would oppose pushing this back to 2029? What is the likelihood that this case could get dismissed free and clear?
So the criminal justice system in general likes finality and does not like to disturb jury verdicts. So we're not talking about assuming that the judge says that the immunity decision doesn't upend this conviction. We don't like disturbing jury verdicts unless there's some legal reason to do so. Now, we have never been here before. As I said, we've never struggled with this question. But I think to just trash the jury verdict because Trump was elected to be president again doesn't necessarily legally make sense. Having said that, acknowledging either based on what the sentence is, maybe it's just a fine, or when the sentence is given, maybe it's after the administration, acknowledging that we're not talking about, Donald Smith, we're talking about Donald Trump. I think that does make sense. And sentencing is sometimes postponed for other reasons. We've just never been in a situation where it's postponed because the person being sentenced was just elected to be president.
Graham Kates and Jessica Levinson, thank you both so much.